When I first stepped across the threshold of the abandoned Lyceum Theatre, the ashes were still warm beneath my boots. A faint thread of smoke curled from a collapsed beam as though some ghostly hand continued to stoke the embers. Holmes stood a little ahead of me, his profile lit by the early morning light that had forced its way through a shattered dome of stained glass. The place felt neither dead nor living. It breathed with the residue of an event that had unfolded only hours before, yet left no living witness to tell how the night had burned itself to ruin. Holmes bent low near the charred orchestra pit, touching a scorched scrap of velvet that had somehow survived the flames, and in that quiet gesture I sensed he had already begun stitching together the unseen narrative left behind by the vanished actors. Nothing moved except a single rope still swaying from the flies, suggesting someone had only just fled the stage. The smell of burnt paint mingled with the faintest trace of perfume, both drifting through the ruined hall like two conflicting testimonies at a trial. In recounting this affair now, I find myself wishing to guide not only the dedicated reader, but also those newly drawn to Holmes's singular world. If you wish to follow our further investigations with the same attentiveness that Holmes applies to every footprint and broken matchstick, you may accompany us again simply by returning to this chronicle whenever curiosity stirs. Now, let me draw back the curtain on the chapters that shaped this strange case. The first light of morning crept through the broken dome of the Lyceum Theatre as though the sun itself hesitated before trespassing upon the ruin. I remember the way the pale beams slid over the blistered stage boards, catching the drifting motes of ash that floated like mournful remnants of an interrupted performance. Holmes moved ahead of me without a word, his steps soundless on the charred floor, his figure cutting a sharp, decisive silhouette against the hollowed grandeur of the once lavish hall. It was difficult not to feel as though we were trespassing upon a grave, for the devastation had a solemnity that stilled one's breath. Yet Holmes's eyes held a glint that suggested he was already listening, to the faint whispers hidden within the soot, to the final quiet gestures of a night that had refused to give up its secrets. A single rope hung from the flies above, still swaying with a languor that made it seem freshly disturbed. Holmes's gaze lifted to it. "Curious," he murmured, though more to himself than to me. He knelt beside a collapsed beam where traces of melted varnish glistened like dark amber. From beneath it, he extracted a shard of glass no larger than a thumbnail. Its edge held a peculiar discoloration, a faint crimson stain that had somehow survived the inferno. He rolled it gently between his fingers before slipping it into his pocket. I felt the same silence that filled the theatre gather. Behind us, like an unseen audience, waiting for the first spoken line. The orchestra pit emitted a soft sigh as its weakened planks shifted under our weight. Holmes leaned forward, studying a cluster of footprints left in the ash. They overlapped, confused by the churn of activity from the fire brigade, yet several impressions near the conductor's stand remained untouched. "Forensic negligence," he said quietly, though without reproach. "But fortune has preserved what carelessness might have lost." He brushed the ash lightly and exposed the outline of a heel with a distinctive angled notch. It belonged, unmistakably, to no member of the brigade. A performer, perhaps, or someone who wished the world to think them one. Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest as he straightened. It was then that the faint scent of perfume reached us, an aroma strangely at odds with the smoky air. It came from a fragment of velvet on the rail of the balcony. A clean cut along its edge suggested it had not been torn by fire but removed deliberately. I found myself thinking of a woman standing there in the dark before the blaze, watching something unfold below her with a heart trembling between fear and resolve. But Holmes, of course, trusted no such romantic projection. He lifted the velvet to his nose with the detached care of a chemist examining a volatile sample. Jasmine, though blended with something heavier, not inexpensive. The observation hung in the air like a clue whispered by the theatre itself. We crossed the stage toward the dressing room corridor where the fire had not reached with as much ferocity. The walls, once painted a cheerful cream, were now streaked with soot that had seeped into every carved crevice. A mirror hung crookedly on a nail, its surface cracked in a spiderweb pattern that distorted our reflections into a dozen ghostly figures. Holmes paused before it, his fingertips hovering just above the glass. A smear of soot near the edge bore the shape of a hand, small, slender, and placed with purpose rather than panic. "A message?" I asked, though even as I spoke I felt that the question carried the naivete of habit. Holmes rarely assumed intention where simple human instinct sufficed. He shook his head lightly. "No, more likely the mark of someone who steadied themselves in haste. Yet its location is unusual. She was not passing through, she was waiting." He traced the outline without touching it. "And she waited here for longer than fear alone would permit." A corridor to our right opened into the performers' rehearsal space. The room had escaped the flames almost entirely, though it bore the weight of abandonment more keenly than the stage. Sheet music lay scattered across the floor, some pages crisped at the edges, others perfectly intact. A single chair sat upright at the center of the room as though expecting an occupant who had stepped away only moments before. Holmes strode toward a music stand and examined a program that had been pinned beneath a fallen frame. Its lists of performers bore neat, ornate type, but one name had been neatly cut out with a blade. Holmes's face settled into stillness, a state I had come to recognize as the moment before he revealed a crucial thought. He turned the program over and tapped the back of it. "Watson, note the clean precision of this removal. This was excision, not impulse. Someone wished this performer forgotten in haste, but without attracting suspicion from those who knew the roles existed." "But why not burn the program entirely?" I asked. Holmes's lips tightened, not unkindly. "Because destruction is sometimes louder than erasure." He folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his coat. A faint sound reached us then, a distant creak, low and drawn out, somewhere from the farthest part of the building. Instinctively, my hand went to my revolver. Holmes raised a finger, urging silence. For a moment, the air hung motionless. Then came a second creak, accompanied by the distinct sound of a door easing shut. We moved together down the passageway, past dressing rooms that yielded only the hollow after-scent of grease paint and dust. At the corridor's end, a half-open door led into a stairwell that descended to the cellar. Holmes motioned for the lamp by the wall, and I lifted it. The flame inside trembled, casting wavering shadows on the staircase. The air below was cooler, carrying neither smoke nor perfume but the faint smell of damp mortar. As we descended, the theater above us seemed to fade into a distant realm of ruin, replaced by the claustrophobic hush of the underground. The cellar was larger than expected, wide enough to house props, costumes, and set pieces from years of performances. Boxes lay stacked against the walls, many marked with fading labels from forgotten productions. Holmes moved between them with an intent that suggested he already anticipated what we might find. Then he stopped abruptly. At the far end of the cellar, a small window at ground level let in a thin sliver of morning light. In that light, a set of footprints appeared clearly on the dusty floor. Fresh, unmistakably so. Someone had fled through this way during the night. Holmes knelt, studying the tracks with the meticulous reverence of an archivist examining a rare manuscript. "The same angled notch," he murmured. "But here, look." He pointed to a slight drag in one of the footprints. Weight shifted to favor the right side. An injury, perhaps, or a limp too subtle for most to observe. "Could the person still be nearby?" I whispered. Holmes tilted his head in a manner that suggested he was listening not just to the cellar but to the world above. "If they are, they will not linger long. This individual knows the theater intimately." We followed the footprints to a small door that opened onto an alley behind the building. The cold air rushed in, carrying the IT city's morning sounds, the rattle of milk carts, the murmur of early pedestrians, the distant whistle of a constable. The alley itself was empty. Only a thin curl of smoke rose from the nearest chimney, echoing the final remnants of the fire behind us. Holmes gazed upward at the theatre's rear facade. "This was no mere accident, Watson. Someone staged last night's event with deliberate orchestration." He stepped back inside, his coat brushing the doorframe. "And the performance is far from over." The sun rose higher, illuminating the ruins with an almost tender glow, as though London itself wished to console the theatre for its loss. Yet every warm beam seemed only to expose new scars, melted sconces, twisted iron railings, burnt music stands. The visual contrast was striking, and I felt in that moment that we were witnessing not an ending, but the opening scene of a far darker drama. Holmes paused at the foot of the stage and surveyed the hall one final time before turning to me. There was no triumph in his expression, only a deepening resolve. "We must speak with the theatre's surviving company," he said. "But not here. There is someone else we must find first." The rope above us gave a final, soft sway, though no breeze had touched it, and so the ember refused to die. The morning carried a subdued chill as we left the burned ruin of the Lyceum and stepped into the quieter side streets that wound their way toward Covent Garden. Holmes walked with a swift, deliberate stride, neither hurried nor relaxed, but in that keen, measured pace he took whenever his mind had locked itself around the early shape of a puzzle. I followed beside him, glancing back once at the theatre's distant silhouette. Its dome cracked like an eggshell, its walls breathing out faint threads of smoke that curled upward into the pallid sky. It was difficult not to sense the building watching us depart, as though some unseen spectator waited for our return. Holmes did not speak until we turned into a narrow mews where a single hansom cab stood waiting. Its driver, wrapped against the cold in a thick woolen overcoat, regarded us with mild curiosity. Holmes gave him an address near Drury Lane, and soon we were rolling through the awakening streets, the rhythmic clatter of hooves blending with the soft murmurs of market vendors setting out their wares. As we passed the Strand, Holmes's gaze shifted briefly to the shop fronts. Booksellers, tobacconists, the familiar press kiosks already receiving their day's fresh bundles. "There will undoubtedly be mention of the fire in the afternoon editions," he said. "Public appetite gravitates swiftly towards spectacle." "Do you suspect the press may distort the facts before we uncover them?" I asked. Holmes's expression curved into a faint, knowing smile. "My dear Watson, the press will construct a truth of its own. Ours merely seeks to intersect with it where it may." The cab drew to a halt before a modest brick building that housed the rehearsal offices for several London troupes. Its facade bore none of the Lyceum's grandeur. Instead, it presented the anonymity of a place where talent was shaped rather than displayed. Inside, the air was warmed by a coal stove and tinged faintly with the scent of grease paint. A few worn posters lined the walls, their edges curling like the corners of forgotten memories. Holmes's eyes flicked over each of them before he approached a door marked "Company Offices." A woman in her mid-40s answered our knock. She wore a simple grey dress, and although her face was pale from worry, her bearing suggested a resilience that had carried her through more than her share of theatrical crises. "You must be Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We were told you might come after seeing the theatre." Holmes inclined his head. "Mrs. Harcourt, I presume. You served as the manager of the Lyceum's private rehearsals?" "I did," she replied, ushering us inside. "Though after what happened last night, I hardly know what remains of my position." She gestured toward two chairs opposite her desk. "Please sit." The room was small and dimly lit, yet every inch of its surface bore the marks of hurried activity. Ledgers half open, telegraphs piled beside an inkwell, and a stack of programs tied neatly with twine. Mrs. Harcourt folded her hands on the desk. "The constables believe the fire started in the prop storage," she began. "But I cannot accept that. It spread too quickly, far too deliberately." Holmes leaned forward slightly, but his voice remained calm. "And you suspect someone within the company?" Her lips tightened, not in accusation, but in pain. "I cannot say for certain. The troop is like a family in some ways, but families hide their grievances better than most." She hesitated. "There were tensions recently. Rivalries. And there was." She paused again, her gaze drifting toward the stack of programs. "There was the matter of our new performer." "The one whose name was removed from the program," Holmes said. She looked at him with startled admiration. "You've already seen it?" "We have." Her hands clenched. "It was Miss Evelina Pierce. She joined us only a month ago, a remarkable talent, though something of an enigma. She spoke little of her past, but her voice— good heavens, her voice could silence an entire room." Her breath quivered. "She was meant to debut last night." "Was she present yesterday evening?" I asked. Mrs. Harcourt shook her head. "I saw her during the afternoon rehearsal, but after that, no. She left abruptly, claiming a headache." Her expression clouded. She seemed nervous, distracted, as though expecting someone who never arrived. Holmes's fingers tapped lightly on his knee. "Did anyone go to look for her once the fire began?" "Only Mr. Alton, our stage hand. He's devoted to the troupe, but when I asked him after the blaze, he insisted he found no one." Her voice dropped. Yet he seemed unsettled. "He would not meet my eyes." Holmes nodded. "We shall speak with Mr. Alton later. For now, Miss Pierce, what of her relationships with the rest of the company?" Mrs. Harcourt hesitated again, then opened a drawer and drew out a telegram. "This arrived 2 days ago, addressed to her but delivered here by mistake." She passed it across the desk. The telegram bore a single line. "Meet before curtain. Urgent. You are not safe." The signature had been torn away. Holmes examined the message with a curiosity that bordered on admiration. A warning delivered too late, it seems. He handed the telegram back. "Did Miss Pierce seem frightened when she received any other messages?" Mrs. Harcourt swallowed. "I cannot say. She was private, but someone called upon her last week, late in the evening. A gentleman? I did not catch his name, but he left with visible distress. I recall thinking she had delivered him ill news." Before Holmes could speak again, a soft knock sounded at the door. A young man stepped inside, narrow-shouldered, his hair in disarray, his hands stained with soot that no amount of scrubbing seemed to remove. "Forgive me, Mrs. Harcourt," he said, his voice wavering. "I didn't know you had visitors." "This is Mr. Alton," Mrs. Harcourt said quietly. Holmes rose smoothly. "Mr. Alton, I should like a word with you." The young man looked nearly ready to bolt, but something in Holmes's demeanor steadied him. We followed him back into the corridor, where he leaned against the wall as though the building itself were the only thing keeping him from collapsing. Holmes approached him with the gentle directness of a surgeon preparing a delicate incision. "You were at the theater when the fire began," Holmes said. "Yes," Alton whispered. "I was setting up the backdrop for the final act." "You attempted to find Miss Pierce." Alton's eyes flickered, betraying a twitch of fear. I didn't see her. I swear I didn't." "But you looked for her." A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. "Yes. No. I looked into her dressing room. She wasn't there. Her cloak was gone." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Her cloak?" Alton nodded. "She had a dark velvet cloak she always kept on a hook, but when I went in, gone." Holmes exchanged a pointed glance with me. The fragment of scented velvet on the balcony rail suddenly felt heavier in my coat pocket. "Why did you not tell Mrs. Harcourt this earlier?" Holmes asked. Alton's breath hitched. "Because I wasn't supposed to be near her dressing room. She asked me once to stop fetching things for her. Said it drew the wrong sort of attention. What sort of attention? Holmes asked softly. Alton hesitated, then whispered, There were men watching her, sir. Men she pretended not to know. But I saw them, waiting outside after rehearsals. One of them followed her more than once. Before Holmes could press him further, a door at the end of the corridor opened, and a tall figure stepped inside. His coat was immaculate, his expression composed, yet shadowed by fatigue. He surveyed the room with a faint impatience before addressing Mrs. Harcourt from afar. I came as soon as I heard. Is there any news? Mrs. Harcourt introduced him as Mr. James Carroway, the troupe's lead actor and one of the theatre's principal investors. Holmes studied him with a quiet, penetrating focus. Mr. Carroway, Holmes began, were you acquainted with Miss Pierce? Carroway's jaw tightened. Acquainted, yes. Familiar, no. She kept to herself, though the public adored her even before her debut. Her rare beauty draws attention, and attention draws trouble. Holmes's eyebrow lifted. And what trouble do you refer to? Carroway sighed. There was a man who attended every rehearsal, sat alone in the balcony, never applauded, never spoke, simply watched her. His presence unsettled the company. Miss Pierce pretended not to see him, but I believe she saw little else. Holmes's voice lowered. Did you recognize him? No. Carroway glanced toward the door. But he carried himself like someone unaccustomed to the rougher districts of London. Holmes absorbed the information with visible interest. You said he was present at each rehearsal. Was he there yesterday? Carroway paused. Yes, but he left before the fire. Alone? I believe so. Holmes's eyes narrowed, not with suspicion toward Carroway, but toward the invisible figure now threading itself through our investigation like a discordant note in an unfinished symphony. When we stepped back outside, the winter air embraced us once more. Holmes paused on the pavement and looked toward the distant theater's still lingering smoke. Watson, he said quietly, there are too many whispers, too many secrets fluttering behind those curtains, and secrecy in the theater is seldom theatrical. What do you make of Miss Pierce? I asked. Holmes's gaze turned toward the Strand, where London bustled in harmless ignorance. She is the ember at the heart of this fire, and whoever warned her she was not safe knew precisely why. A cab rattled past, stirring the hem of Holmes's coat. He did not move. The wings hold more than whispers, he murmured. They hold design. His eyes shone with the sharpness I had come to recognize, the moment when a case ceased to be merely curious and became personal to him, woven into the inner workings of his mind. We must find Miss Evelina Pierce. The wind carried the faintest trace of jasmine. The daylight had strengthened by the time we left Drury Lane, yet London wore its brightness uneasily, as though some invisible pressure lingered in the air. Holmes hailed a hansom with a sharp motion of his gloved hand, and we climbed inside. The driver cracked his whip, and the cab lurched forward into the bustle of the late morning. Costermongers shouting their wares, bootblacks clustered on corners, clerks hurrying with rolled papers under their arms. Yet all of it felt mere backdrop, for Holmes sat in a stillness that suggested his thoughts raced faster than any cab could carry us. His eyes fixed not on the passing scenery, but on a point somewhere well beyond it, as though the pattern of the case hovered faintly before him, waiting for shape. "Watson," he said suddenly, "there is something the troupe fears more than scandal, more than financial ruin, more even than the fire itself." "And what might that be?" I asked. "The return of someone they hoped would never reappear." Before I could speak, the cab jerked to a halt on Bow Street. Holmes stepped down swiftly, coat flaring behind him. We approached a narrow building wedged between a pawnbroker and a tobacconist, an unassuming lodging house whose windows bore thin curtains and whose brass knocker had been polished recently. A discreet sign beside the door read, "Rooms Let." Holmes gave a short, decisive rap. A thin, soft-voiced woman answered. Her posture was slightly stooped, yet the clarity in her eyes suggested a sharp mind accustomed to weighing the truthfulness of her tenants. "Yes, gentlemen?" she asked. Holmes offered a polite bow. "Mrs. Grimsby, I believe. We seek information concerning a Miss Evelina Pierce." Her expression tightened with caution. "Are you with the police?" "No, merely concerned parties." She hesitated, studying Holmes with the careful discernment of someone who has seen both liars and honest men attempt to disguise themselves. Finally, she opened the door wider. "Come in, then. I will not speak where the neighbors might hear." The hallway smelled faintly of lavender and coal smoke. A kettle hissed in the adjoining kitchen. Mrs. Grimsby gestured for us to sit at a small table covered in a crocheted cloth. Her hands trembled just slightly as she poured tea, though her voice steadied when she spoke. "Miss Pierce stayed here for a short time," she began. "Paid in advance, kept to herself, and left the room in far better order than most do. A model tenant, I suppose you might say." "When did she leave?" Holmes asked. 2 weeks ago. Moved to a private room closer to the theater." She took a slow breath. "She said she wished to be nearer rehearsals." Holmes's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Did she receive visitors while lodging here?" Mrs. Grimsby set her cup down. "Only one. A gentleman who arrived late one evening. He asked for her by name, though he seemed uncertain whether she would receive him. I remember the way he looked, nervous, pale, and carrying the weight of some terrible expectation." "What happened when Miss Pierce saw him?" I asked. "She did not allow him inside." Mrs. Grimsby's voice dropped. They spoke in the hallway, not loudly, but with urgency. She sounded frightened. He sounded pleading. Holmes leaned forward. "Did you hear any specific words?" "Only fragments. He said something about old obligations and 'you must trust me.' She answered with, 'It is too late, and he will not forgive this.' Shortly after, she shut the door. The gentleman stood there for several minutes, staring at the wood as though he could will her to return. Then he left. She clasped her hands tightly. I have not seen him since. Holmes rose with sudden purpose. "Mrs. Grimsby, would you permit me to examine Miss Pierce's former room?" "Of course," she said, though her voice betrayed unease. She led us up a creaking staircase to a small chamber with a single window overlooking the narrow street. The room was immaculate. Bed neatly made, washstand gleaming, and the faintest trace of jasmine clinging to the air like an echo. Holmes moved immediately to the wardrobe, running his fingers along the inner joints. He pressed lightly behind the wainscoting until a small panel loosened with a soft click. From the cavity within, he withdrew a folded sheet of paper. Mrs. Grimsby gasped softly. "I never knew." Holmes gave a reassuring nod. "Lodgers often hide where landlords seldom look." He unfolded the paper. It contained a sketch. Rough, hurried, yet filled with strange intensity. It depicted the audience chamber of the theater, drawn from the perspective of the balcony. Among the darkened silhouettes, one figure was rendered in detail, a man seated alone in the back row, head tilted downward, his hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles were drawn as white streaks. Holmes tapped the edge of the paper. "The watcher?" Mrs. Grimsby stared at the drawing. "That is him," she whispered. "The man who visited her." "Then she feared him," Holmes said. "She feared what followed him," Mrs. Grimsby murmured. Holmes folded the sketch with precise care. "Did Miss Pierce leave any forwarding address?" "No, she simply left a brief note thanking me for my hospitality and saying she must begin anew." Those were her exact words. As we departed, Holmes moved with renewed urgency. Outside, the streets had grown more crowded. A newsboy shouted headlines, none yet about the fire, though Holmes's eyes flicked toward the boy with a calculating gleam. "By afternoon," he muttered, London will have already fashioned its narrative. We must remain ahead of it. We walked briskly back toward Covent Garden. As we neared the market square, a familiar figure pushed through the crowd, Inspector Lestrade. Coat buttoned tightly, expression sharpened by the knowledge of an unfolding investigation. "Holmes," he called. "I had a feeling I'd find you stalking about this district." Holmes offered a courteous nod. "Lestrade, I assume you're here regarding the Lyceum fire?" "Half the yard is," Lestrade grumbled. "Though you'll be amused to know everyone believes you'll solve it before we finish gathering statements." His eyes narrowed. "Tell me, do you suspect foul play?" Holmes smiled thinly. "I suspect design." Lestrade released a breath that fogged in the cold air. "The theatre staff are a panicked lot. One swears she saw a cloaked figure leaving before the flames began. Another insists there was a quarrel backstage. And now I hear rumors of a shadowy benefactor who's been pouring money into the Lyceum. I can't separate truth from theatre." "Then allow us to relieve you of some confusion," Holmes said. In a few brief sentences, he relayed what we had learned. The watcher in the balcony, the warning telegram, the cut name in the program, the vanished cloak. Lestrade listened with deepening interest. "I'll put men on the lodging-house visitor," he said after a moment. "Someone must have seen him. A man that strange doesn't move through London without leaving ripples." Holmes's eyebrow rose. "He may move through London more easily than you think." Lestrade grunted. "We'll see. In the meantime, what's your next step?" "Miss Pearce," Holmes said. "We must find her before someone else does." As Lestrade departed, Holmes turned to me. "Watson, there is someone we must speak with. Not from the theatre, not from the lodging-house. Someone who intersects both worlds." "And who is that?" Holmes's expression grew unreadable. "An old acquaintance, one who understands shadows better than most." We took a cab toward Soho, though Holmes remained silent during the ride. It was not the silence of uncertainty, but of orchestration, of a mind arranging the scattered notes of a melody until the first hints of harmony emerged. When we reached the edge of a quiet side street lined with shuttered shops, Holmes stepped out before the cab had fully stopped. A figure stood in the doorway of a dim-lit establishment, a man whose presence seemed to bend the dimness toward him. His sharp eyes, framed beneath the brim of a dark hat, fixed upon Holmes with an expression that was neither welcome nor refusal. "You've come sooner than expected," the man said. Holmes approached him with calm familiarity. Circumstances urged haste. "And what circumstance drives you now?" the man asked. Holmes removed the folded sketch from his coat. "A fire that hides more than ash, and a watcher who has returned to London." The man's expression shifted subtly. Astonishment, dread, recognition. "Then you are already too late," he whispered. Holmes's voice lowered to a thread. "Tell me why." The man stepped back into the dimness of the doorway. "Because the watcher does not pursue Evelina Pearce." He looked Holmes dead in the eye. "He pursues the one she betrayed." The street seemed to fall silent, as though London itself leaned closer. Holmes's posture straightened, every line of him sharpened by new understanding. A cold current moved through the air between them. "And who?" Holmes asked softly. "Did she betray?" The man glanced toward the far end of the street, where the afternoon light dimmed under gathering clouds. "Someone who once trusted her with his life." The words hung like the first toll of a bell before disaster. Holmes did not move for a long moment. Then he turned to me with a resolve that bordered on grimness. "Watson," he said, "the stage is shifting." A single gust of wind swept between us, carrying the faintest trace of burnt velvet and something darker beneath it. The afternoon had sunk into that grey, hesitant hour when London appears undecided between daylight and dusk, the lamps not yet lit, the shadows stretching long and thin across the cobbles. Holmes and I moved through Soho at a brisk pace, Though the weight of the conversation with the man in the doorway, Holmes had called him an acquaintance, but his manner suggested a far more intricate connection, clung to us like a film of cold mist. I could not shake the feeling that we had stepped not merely deeper into the case, but into some uncharted region of Holmes's own past, a place he rarely allowed even me to glimpse. Holmes climbed into the waiting hansom with the precision of a man who had already chosen his next destination long before we'd returned to the street. "To Charing Cross Road," he instructed the driver. When the cab rattled into motion, he leaned back and steepled his fingers beneath his chin, eyes half-lidded but far from resting. "You recognized him," I said quietly. Holmes did not open his eyes. "Recognition is a complicated matter, Watson. It implies a past one has accepted. Some acquaintances merely resurface from shadows one hoped would remain still." "Did he speak truthfully?" Holmes's eyes opened then, sharp as flint. He spoke fearfully, and fear in a man of his disposition is more revealing than any confession. The cab slowed before a tall, narrow building with a faded gilt sign that read Marchand & Co., Theatrical Accountants. Holmes alighted with the air of someone approaching a stage whose script he had already deduced. Inside, a bell chimed faintly as we entered, and a thin man with a powdered wig, more theatrical than fashionable, rose from his desk with a stiff, anxious posture. "Good afternoon," he said, voice pitched high with surprise. "May I assist you?" Holmes produced a card. "Sherlock Holmes, this is Dr. John Watson. We require access to the account books of the Lyceum Theatre." The accountant blinked several times in rapid succession, much like an automaton whose gears had slipped. "Sir, that is highly irregular." "Highly." Holmes's tone became soft, almost gentle, but threaded with iron. "Mr. Marshall, I assure you the irregularity is far more profound than you realize. Decidez dit. Fire has consumed your client's establishment. Lives may have been endangered. I trust you would not place bureaucratic discomfort above truth." The man shifted uncomfortably, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. Well, yes, of course. The fire is tragic. But the accounts, those ledgers are confidential." Holmes placed one hand lightly atop the desk. "Confidentiality is the privilege of the living. I believe one of your ledgers has recently been tampered with. Quietly, elegantly, but unmistakably." Marchand's jaw dropped. "Tampered with? How could you possibly—" "Because," Holmes said, "the Lyceum's finances have been unusually buoyant these past months, despite declining ticket sales, and that incongruence never reaches my ears without reason." Marchand looked around the room as though hoping for a rescuer to emerge from the stationery cupboard. Finding none, he let out a defeated sigh and opened a drawer with trembling fingers. "Very well, but only briefly, and if anyone asks—" "No one will ask," Holmes said. He was handed a thick ledger bound in cracked leather. Its corners were softened by age, its spine worn from years of careful entries. Holmes carried it to a small table near the window. There, with the care of a surgeon preparing an incision, he opened its pages. At first glance, the entries appeared immaculate. Rows of inked figures, columns tallied with precision. But Holmes's gaze drifted immediately to a space midway down the page, a faint discoloration where ink did not match its neighbors, a line too straight to have been written at speed, a figure whose tail stroke ended abruptly, unlike the accountant's habitual flourish. "Page 87, Holmes murmured. "Someone has removed a page." Marchand nearly toppled from his seat. "That is impossible. I would have noticed—" "Not if it was done with a blade thin enough to slide between the binding threads," Holmes replied. He slid a fingernail gently beneath the inner column, revealing the slightest warp where a leaf had been excised. Removed deliberately, precisely, and replaced with a sheet made to resemble the original stock. A clever forgery, undoubtedly the work of a hand accustomed to delicate deceptions. Marchand's face drained of color. "But who?" Who would do such a thing? Holmes did not look up. Someone who wished the theatre's benefactors to appear conventional, when in truth one benefactor in particular preferred the safety of shadow. He flipped through several pages, his expression sharpening as new patterns emerged. "Watson," he said softly, beckoning me closer. "Observe the donations listed here. 3 months ago, a series of anonymous contributions appear, first small, then growing. And these symbols—" He pointed to a faint mark beside each entry, resembling a 3-pronged flourish. "Do you recognize it?" he asked. I frowned. "It appears ornamental." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Or codified." Marchand leaned forward. "I never placed those marks myself." "No," Holmes said, "but someone wished to track their own pattern of giving or spending." He flipped back and forth between pages, gradually assembling the rhythm of the entries. "The pattern is consistent. Each marked donation precedes a major production change. New costumes, new set designs, new lighting installations. Someone was purchasing influence within the theater under the guise of generosity." Marchand swallowed hard. "But for what purpose?" Holmes closed the ledger gently and returned it to the trembling accountant. "To control it, to shape its future, and perhaps to protect someone within it." He turned toward the door. "Watson, come. There is more to learn." But as we began to leave, a sudden gust of wind blew through the room, carrying with it the sharp scent of ink and something else, an odor faint, metallic, and disturbingly familiar. Holmes paused. His nose lifted slightly. "Blood," he whispered. Marchand looked horrified. "Blood? In an accountancy office?" Holmes stepped toward the rear of the room, following the scent with predatory precision. Behind a tall cabinet, he found a narrow service door left slightly ajar. When he pulled it open, the source revealed itself, a smear of dried blood on the inner frame. "Watson," he said quietly, "someone injured left this way." The door led into a cramped stairwell descending into a cellar. Marchand wrung his hands in panic. This door is rarely used. Only for receiving deliveries. I swear it was clean yesterday." Holmes did not answer. He descended the stairs cautiously, his hand trailing lightly along the banister. The cellar was dim, the air heavy with the scent of dust and ink. Boxes of old posters and unused ledger books were stacked haphazardly. Holmes moved among them until his foot struck something soft. A discarded glove, ladies-sized, velvet, and scented faintly, hauntingly, of jasmine. My breath tightened. "Evelina Pierce," I whispered. Holmes knelt and lifted the glove delicately. "Or someone who wished us to think so." His voice had dropped into that still, focused register I had heard only in the gravest of cases. "But if Miss Pierce shed this here, she did so unwillingly." A thin mark of dried blood lined the glove's inner wrist. Holmes rose slowly. "She was here within the past 2 days." I felt the weight of the discovery settle into my bones. But why would she come to a theatrical accountant's cellar? Holmes turned the glove over in his hand. "Not willingly, Watson. Someone brought her here." The cellar seemed to darken. Above us, the faint creak of the office floorboards broke the silence. Marchand pacing anxiously, unaware that his building had become a waypoint in a perilous game. Holmes's gaze drifted across the cellar toward a locked iron cabinet near the far wall. It bore no label, only a faint set of scratches near the keyhole. "Watson," he said, stepping closer, "what we seek may lie within." He pulled a thin pick from his coat and began to work the lock. The mechanism clicked open with surprising ease. Inside the cabinet lay a stack of documents, contracts, receipts, deeds, and atop them a ledger smaller than the one above, bound in black leather. Holmes lifted it with the tenderness one reserves for something dangerous. "The Phantom's ledger," he murmured. I leaned closer as he opened it. The pages were filled with entries unlike those of the main accounts. Coded notes, initials, and sums far larger than any legitimate donation. And then, on the 5th page, a name written not in full, but in partial cursive flourish. E.P. Holmes stared at the initials as though they were a spark threatening to ignite the entire case into flame. "She was part of this," he whispered, "willingly or not." He closed the ledger with a decisive snap, and in that moment, somewhere above us, the bell at the front door rang sharply, followed by hurried footsteps. Holmes's eyes flashed. "Watson, someone has followed us." The cellar seemed to hold its breath. Holmes slipped the glove and the black ledger into his coat. The footsteps grew closer, descending the stairs with deliberate, purposeful weight. Holmes moved to the shadows, his voice barely audible. "Be still." A silhouette appeared at the top of the staircase. Tall, motionless, watching. For a heartbeat, the world froze. Then the figure retreated without a word. Holmes exhaled slowly, though his eyes remained sharp with calculation. "They were not ready to confront us," he murmured, "but they wanted us to know they were here." We ascended the stairs cautiously. The office stood empty. The front door hung slightly open, swinging in the faint breeze. Holmes stepped into the street, scanning the passing crowd. But the watcher, if it was indeed the watcher, had vanished. Holmes turned to me with a quiet intensity. "The ledger reveals a patron lurking behind the theatre's public face. And Miss Pierce," he said, touching the glove in his coat, "was either a pawn or a threat to them." The wind stirred, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke from the ruined theatre. Holmes's voice grew low. "We must find her before the phantom does." The street darkened further as the lamps sputtered to life, their flames flickering like uneasy hearts. Somewhere in the distance, a carriage wheel screeched, and the ghost of Jasmine lingered in the evening air. The streets glimmered with the first hesitant reflections of lamplight as Holmes and I moved away from Charing Cross Road, the black ledger concealed within his coat like a secret heartbeat. London, in this hour between late afternoon and the deeper fold of evening, seemed to tighten around us. Carriages clattered over damp cobblestones, their wheels throwing up thin ribbons of water. Shop fronts glowed faintly behind fogged panes, yet every sound felt muffled beneath an invisible pressure settling over the city. Holmes's stride remained relentlessly steady, but I sensed from the taut stillness of his jaw that the shadow we had glimpsed in the accountant's stairwell had woven itself into his thoughts. We walked until the noise of traffic softened behind us and turned onto a quieter street lined with townhouses whose windows glowed with warm domestic lights. Holmes stopped abruptly. "Watson," he murmured, "we must think carefully before our next move. Whoever followed us knows we have the ledger. That alone may alter the entire course of this affair." I nodded, unable to shake the image of the silent silhouette on the cellar stairs. "Do you believe it was the watcher Miss Pierce feared?" Holmes's gaze drifted toward a distant rooftop. "If so, he is bolder than I anticipated. If not, then multiple forces circle this case, and that is a complexity we cannot afford to underestimate." We resumed our walk. Holmes led us through a maze of back streets until we reached a small square bordered by plane trees. A fountain stood at its center, its trickles softened under the weight of twilight. Holmes chose a bench with a clear view of all approaches and sat, withdrawing the black ledger with the quiet reverence of a scholar unsealing a forbidden manuscript. "Observe," he said as he opened it again. "The coded entries begin nearly a year ago, and the sums grow progressively larger." I leaned in, studying the delicate strokes of ink, the subtle fluctuations in the handwriting. "Do you believe they were written by the same hand?" Holmes tilted the ledger toward the lamplight. "The pen pressure differs. The angles shift. Several entries appear copied, not written by instinct. Someone wished to hide the true author." "But why so many layers of secrecy?" I asked. What purpose would require both erasure and concealment? Holmes's eyes narrowed. A purpose one must protect at all costs. The theatre, Watson, is merely the stage. Behind it is the architect. The term architect hung in the air with the weight of a revelation only half spoken. Holmes traced a fingertip along the margin beside one of the larger sums. A symbol had been inked there, a stylized flourish that resembled not merely ornamentation but intent. "There is pattern in the chaos," he murmured. "Someone used this ledger as a map." To what end? Holmes closed the book gently. To guide us, perhaps, or to mislead us entirely. Before I could respond, the low rustle of footsteps brushed across the square. I tensed, scanning the shadows between the trees, but Holmes remained motionless. The figure that emerged into the lamplight was neither threatening nor hidden. Rather, a young boy in a patched coat, no more than 12. He approached with cautious steps. "Beg pardon, sir," he said, timidly, addressing Holmes. "Are you Mr. Sherlock Holmes of Baker Street?" Holmes regarded him with quiet curiosity. "I am." The boy extended a folded piece of paper. "A gentleman gave me a shilling to bring this to you. He said it were urgent." Holmes took the paper, but did not open it immediately. "What did the gentleman look like?" The boy frowned. "Not much to see, sir. Hat down low. Walked with a cane, but didn't seem to need it. Smelled a bit like smoke. He was standing near the alley behind the bookshop." Holmes's expression shifted in the faintest way, eyes sharpening, shoulders narrowing by a fraction. "Thank you," he said, handing the boy a coin. "Go straight home." When the boy vanished into the dusk, Holmes unfolded the note. The handwriting was elegant, controlled, and signed with no name. "You search in the wrong direction. She hides near the place where she first learned to fear the dark. If you wish to find her alive, go before the clock strikes 9. I felt a chill lance through me, though the air held no wind. "This is a trap," I said. Holmes folded the note with swift decisiveness. "It is both trap and truth. We must discern which it is before acting." "What place do you suppose he refers to?" I asked. Holmes rose from the bench and began pacing slowly, his coat catching the faint glow of the lamps. "Miss Pierce's history remains largely concealed, but fear leaves deeper footprints than memory. She must have confided in someone, albeit unwillingly." He paused mid-stride. "The first place a performer learns to fear darkness is backstage. Before one masters the light, one is lost in the shadows." "You mean her earlier theatre?" I said. Holmes nodded. "Precisely. Before the Lyceum, Miss Pierce performed briefly with a smaller troupe in Southwark, a modest establishment, a makeshift stage with heavy curtains and unreliable lanterns. Rumor suggested a mishap occurred there, a collapse, perhaps, or an accident that left her visibly shaken. She departed shortly after. Cold understanding washed through me. Then whoever sent the message knows her past. "Knows it intimately," Holmes said, "and uses it with precision." He glanced toward the darkening sky. "We must move quickly." Yet as we hailed another cab, I could not silence the heaviness rising within me. If the watcher anticipated our pursuit, then each step we took brought us into his design. Holmes sensed my unease, though he offered no reassurance. He simply watched the passing streets with an intensity that hinted at a deeper conflict, one not merely with the investigation but within the recesses of his own mind. As the cab neared the river and crossed into the humbler lanes of Southwark, the atmosphere shifted palpably. Street lamps flickered dimly, and the scent of the Thames mingled with the odor of coal and damp timber. We disembarked near a narrow alley, its entrance framed by decaying brickwork and an old wooden sign reading "The Red Swan Theatre," though half the letters had faded. The theatre itself stood recessed behind two adjoining buildings, its facade slumped as though exhausted by years of neglect. A single lantern glowed faintly above the door, its wick sputtering weakly in the wind. Holmes approached with measured caution. "Keep your revolver ready," he said softly, "but do not draw it unless I instruct you." I nodded, heart thudding steadily against my ribs. The door creaked open with a long, exhausted sigh. Inside, the theater felt suspended between worlds, abandoned yet not entirely lifeless. Rows of empty wooden seats faced a stage framed by heavy curtains that drooped from their rails. The air carried the scent of damp velvet, dust, and something else, a faint, lingering trace of jasmine. Holmes moved ahead, lantern in hand, casting elongated shadows across the warped floorboards. "This place has not been used in months," he murmured. "And yet—" He bent down, touching a thread of black fabric caught on a splinter of wood. "Her cloak," he said softly. A sudden clatter echoed from the backstage corridor. I froze. Holmes straightened, motionless as a drawn bow. The silence that followed was taut, stretched thin as wire. He whispered, "Watson, this way." We moved through a side passage into a narrow hallway lined with cracked dressing-room mirrors. The lantern's glow fractured into 100 ghostly reflections. At the far end of the corridor, a door stood ajar. Holmes approached it slowly, each step deliberate. Inside, the dressing room was dim, but not untouched. A stool lay overturned. A bottle of smelling salts was smashed on the floor, and on the dressing table lay a handkerchief, embroidered with the initials E.P., stained with a thin line of dried blood. Holmes examined it lightly. "She was here," he murmured. "And recently." "But where is she now?" I asked. As if in answer, a faint whisper drifted from the stage, a voice barely audible, fragile as a dying ember. "Holmes." I felt my pulse lurch. Holmes moved swiftly back down the corridor, the lantern's flame trembling as though responding to the tension that filled the air. The whisper came again, closer now, strained and ragged. "Holmes." We reached the stage. The vast emptiness of the theater pressed inward like a held breath. Holmes raised the lantern, casting light across the dusty floor. A figure stood at the center of the stage. Not Miss Pierce. A tall man, coat draped like a cloak around him, hat brim casting his face in shadow. He stood utterly still, as though carved from the darkness itself. Holmes exhaled slowly. "You?" The man lifted his head. Though I could not see his eyes, I felt his gaze pierce the space between us with chilling precision. "You should not have come," he said, his voice quiet, yet edged with unmistakable command. Holmes stepped forward, though every muscle in him seemed braced against some invisible force. "Where is Evelina Pierce?" A soft, almost sorrowful laugh escaped the man. "You seek her," he said, "but she seeks only to disappear." Holmes's jaw clenched. "She is in danger." The man tilted his head slightly. "We are all in danger." A single beam of moonlight slipped through a crack in the ceiling, illuminating his cane. Its silver handle bore the same three-pronged symbol found in the ledger. Holmes saw it, and in that moment, something within him changed, subtly, profoundly. "You," he whispered, voice tight, "you were the benefactor." The man's silence confirmed it. Holmes took a step forward. Why burn the theater? At this, the man's posture stiffened and he lifted his cane as if to ward off a blow. Though no blow came, he whispered, "Because the theater was never meant to survive the truth." And with a suddenness that stole my breath, he turned and vanished into the shadows behind the stage, swallowed by a darkness as complete as a closing curtain. I reached instinctively for my revolver, but Holmes raised a hand. "No," he said. "He wants us to chase him." The theater felt colder, emptier, as though the darkness itself had absorbed the man's presence and now held its breath, waiting. Holmes lowered the lantern. His voice had dropped into the deepest timbre of his concentration. "Watson," he murmured. The patterns are shifting, and the mirror through which we have viewed this case was deliberately darkened from the start. He stared into the shadowed corridor where the man had vanished. And the next revelation, he said softly, will not be gentle. The darkness that swallowed the mysterious benefactor felt less like a place he had retreated into and more like a curtain he himself had drawn. Holmes stood at the lip of the stage for several breaths, as though searching not the shadows before him, but the deeper recesses of memory where echoes of similar encounters lived. I had seen Holmes gaze upon many adversaries with calculated detachment, with disdain, even with a spark of delight. But the look that touched his features now was different, sharper, more private, tinged with recognition that unsettled me. "We cannot follow him blindly," Holmes murmured at last. "He choreographs his movements with precision. The moment we step into that corridor, he will have anticipated our angle of pursuit." "And Miss Pierce?" I asked, my eyes scanning the empty theater for any sign she had been present during the confrontation. Holmes's reply came low and thoughtful. "He would not have shown himself if she were still here. He is too careful, too invested in the final outcome." "Then why appear at all?" Holmes turned from the darkened wings and raised the lantern, allowing the light to drift across the hollow ranks of wooden seats. "Because, Watson, masks serve two purposes: concealment and revelation. Montabai wished to reveal himself just enough to redirect us. He wanted us to question the path we were taking." "And do you?" Holmes's face remained unreadable. "We shall see." We left the theater with the same hush that had greeted our arrival. Outside, the fog had begun creeping through the alleyways, not thick enough to obscure shapes entirely, but sufficient to dampen sound and cast halos around the lanterns. The Thames, somewhere nearby in the darkness, seemed to breathe with the slow pulse of an enormous animal at rest. Holmes stopped at the edge of the street, the last sliver of lantern light drawing a line across his profile. "Watson," he said quietly, "reflect upon what we have learned. The Watcher is no mere stranger. He is the silent architect of the theater's transformation, a benefactor whose money shaped its productions, whose presence haunted its rehearsals. He was the man in Miss Pierce's balcony sketch, the man who visited her late at night, the man whose symbol marked every illicit entry in the phantom ledger." "And yet," I said, "he was the one who urged us to find her." Holmes nodded. "Contradiction often signals the presence of truth." We walked in silence until we reached a main road, where a line of hansoms waited beneath the dim gas lights. Holmes hailed one and instructed the driver to take us to Baker Street. As the cab jolted forward, he loosened his coat slightly and removed both the ledger and the handkerchief from within it. He placed them on the seat between us, as though laying out instruments upon an operating table. "She is running," he said, "and doing so under pressure of a threat she once believed she could escape. And yet every step she takes re-entangles her in the web of her past." "And the Watcher?" I asked. "Is he pursuing her, protecting her, or both?" Holmes's fingers traced the monogram on the handkerchief. "He is a man betrayed," he said, "or believes himself to be." The cab rolled past silhouetted lamp-posts and shuttered shops, the faint chiming of a distant church marking the hours. When we reached Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson greeted us with her usual blend of concern and restraint. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of the charred velvet glove Holmes carried, but she asked no questions. She understood the rhythm of our work all too well. Upstairs in our sitting room, the fire burned warmly, but its comfort seemed at odds with the tension that had settled over us like a second cloak. Holmes sat at his customary place by the hearth, striking a match and lighting his pipe with a contemplative slowness. I knew better than to interrupt. This was the hour when Holmes allowed the chaos of an investigation to simmer into structure. At length, he rose and crossed to the bookshelf, where a thin volume titled "Obscure London Playhouses" rested between heavier tomes. He flipped through its pages until he found a reference to the Red Swan Theatre. "Here," he said, tapping the page. 2 years ago. A lantern accident during a rehearsal. A collapse of the rear scaffolding. One performer injured. Severely. Miss Pierce? I asked. Holmes shook his head. No. A man. A supporting actor whose role never escaped the footnotes. But the article states he was engaged in a clandestine affair with an unnamed actress whose star was rising quickly. He lifted his eyes from the page, meeting my gaze with slow, deliberate gravity. Miss Pierce's star. A tremor of unease passed through me. Do you suppose the benefactor was that injured man? Holmes exhaled a thin plume of smoke that curled upward like a question unspoken. If so, his injury may have been the catalyst for this entire affair. A life altered, a future stolen, and perhaps a heart broken. But why burn the Lyceum now? I asked. That, Holmes said, remains the crucial question. He returned the book to the shelf and moved to his writing desk, spreading out the items gathered from the case. The torn program, the warning telegram, the lodged glove, the sketch of the watcher. The objects formed a silent constellation, each connected by faint, invisible lines. Watson, he said, running a fingertip along the edge of the sketch, the watcher possesses considerable means. He funds theaters, influences productions, and disguises his involvement behind forged entries. Yet he hides his face from the world. That kind of secrecy does not arise without powerful motive. And Miss Pierce? I pressed gently. Holmes's voice softened. She is the key, but not to the watcher's identity, to his purpose. He paused then, his gaze drifting to the window where the fog pressed against the glass like a restless thought. Something unspoken flickered across his features, an unease as rare in him as sincerity in a politician. There is a reason she fled her first troupe, he murmured. A reason she feared the dark backstage, a reason she cut her name from the Lyceum program, and a reason someone warned her she was not safe. And the watcher? I asked quietly. Holmes closed the ledger with a decisive thud. He's not hunting her to punish her. At least not solely. There is something he needs from her. Something he cannot reclaim alone. Before I could respond, a firm knock sounded at our door. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. Mrs. Hudson cracked open the sitting-room door. "A visitor for you, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "He insists upon speaking with you this instant." Holmes rose with the smooth, silent precision of a drawn blade. "Send him in." She stepped back, and a small figure entered. A boy. The same boy who had delivered the anonymous note. But now he stood pale, trembling, eyes wide with terror. "Sir," he stammered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know what else to do. The gentleman, he said he'd give me another shilling if I brought you this." He extended a new folded note with shaking hands. Holmes took it slowly, his gaze never leaving the boy's face. "What frightened you?" Holmes asked quietly. The boy swallowed hard. He wasn't alone this time, sir. There was another fellow with him, a woman. I couldn't see her face, but she looked weak, like she could barely stand." Holmes froze. I felt my breath catch. Holmes unfolded the note. 2 words. Too late. The room seemed to constrict. Holmes closed the note with a slow, deliberate motion, his eyes bright with a controlled fury I had rarely seen. "Watson," he said, already reaching for his coat, "this is no longer a pursuit." His voice deepened into something carved from the core of his resolve. "It is a race against the final act." He swept past me, descending the stairs with a speed that left no room for hesitation. I followed at once. And as the door slammed behind us, London's fog pressed in with the heavy stillness of a theatre waiting for the curtain to rise upon tragedy. Night had fully claimed the city by the time Holmes and I reached the Strand. The lamps that lined the thoroughfare glowed like molten beads on a darkened chain, their flames trembling beneath the steady river wind drifting up from the Thames. London, at this hour, breathed differently, more slowly, more warily, as though aware that certain kinds of footsteps pursued only danger. Holmes moved with a purpose sharpened by the chilling message we had received in Baker Street. Too late. In the curve of the letters lay both taunt and lament, but Holmes was not deterred. If anything, the phrase seemed to strike some core within him that propelled him into motion with doubled ferocity. The Strand bustled with late-night carriage traffic, gentlemen departing clubs, and theatre-goers spilling onto the pavements with muffled conversation and lingering excitement. Yet even amid the noise, a strange tension pulsed beneath the surface, an invisible thread pulling through the crowd, tugging us forward. Holmes paused near a newspaper kiosk, his eyes scanning the faces weaving through the lamplight. His attention lingered for a fraction of a second on every passer-by, as though searching for a shadow that did not belong. He turned to me suddenly. "Watson, Southwark was not our only clue this evening. Whoever sent that note wished to draw us into the open, but a trap laid with such theatrical flourish would not rely on a single lure. London itself becomes a stage in these affairs." "And the audience?" I asked. Holmes's lips curved into a thin, grim smile. "The audience is irrelevant. The actors, however, those are what matter." Before I could reply, a carriage sped past us, its wheels rattling violently, its driver whipping the horses harder than any sane cabman would at this hour. Holmes's eyes narrowed. The horses bore the same soot-stained flanks we had seen near the Lyceum, the unmistakable remnants of a stable near the ruined theatre. "Follow that cab," Holmes said, seizing my arm. We hailed another hansom and instructed the driver to pursue the retreating carriage. The chase carried us along the Strand, past theatres whose final acts had ended and whose stages now slept behind heavy curtains. Each passing building seemed to whisper fragments of its own dramas, but we had no time to reflect on such echoes. Our quarry turned sharply into a narrower street, where lamplight dwindled and shadows pressed closer. When the cab ahead finally halted, Holmes signaled our driver to stop at a distance. We disembarked quietly. The carriage we had followed now stood outside a nondescript doorway beside a shuttered tobacconist. The driver had gone. Holmes strode toward the entrance, his eyes keen and dark with calculation. "Watson," he said softly, "prepare yourself. Whatever we find here is unlikely to bring comfort." The doorway led into a narrow hall where stale tobacco smoke clung to the walls like a lingering stain. A flight of stairs rose steeply to the right. Holmes lifted a finger, listening. From above came the faintest sound, whispering, urgent and muffled. He ascended the steps soundlessly, and I followed with care. At the top of the stair stood a closed door. Light leaked beneath it in a thin golden strip. Holmes exhaled once, then glided forward and turned the handle. The door opened without resistance. The room we entered was small, dim and cluttered with discarded stage props. False swords, tattered costumes, painted backdrops rolled haphazardly against the walls. At the center sat a man hunched over a small writing table, his back to us. A single lamp illuminated the papers before him. Holmes took one silent step. The man spoke without turning. "I expected someone," he said, "but not you, Holmes." The voice was unfamiliar, low, tired, worn with despair. Holmes approached him with measured caution. "Then who did you expect?" Slowly, the man raised his head. His face emerged from the dimness, thin, lined, eyes hollowed by nights without rest. He wore no disguise, no cloak, no mask. "I expected the one who followed me," he whispered. Holmes's eyes sharpened. "You were the man accompanying the watcher earlier." The man gave a faint, broken laugh. "If you mean the gentleman with the cane, the one whose shadow stands taller than any man breathing, then yes." though I do not accompany him by choice. "Where is the woman who was with you?" I asked. The man's expression contorted. "She was not Miss Pierce. She was another messenger, someone who owed him a debt. She delivered what he demanded and left immediately. She fears him more than I do." Holmes drew nearer. "Tell me your name." The man looked at Holmes with an expression hovering between resignation and relief. "Alistair Grange. Actor, or I was once." Holmes did not blink. "The injured performer from the Red Swan." Grange nodded. "My leg broke under the falling scaffolding. End of career, end of future, end of everything except her." "Miss Pierce," Holmes said gently. Grange buried his face in his hands. "She left, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. She thought the accident had been meant for her. She told me this the night before she fled Southwark. She said, 'Alistair, we are not alone here. Someone watches, someone listens, and someone wants me gone.' I thought she was delusional, or overwhelmed. I did not believe her." "And now?" Holmes asked. Grange's voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. "Now I know she was telling the truth." Holmes exchanged a brief look with me before speaking again. "Who is the watcher, Grange? What ties him to Miss Pierce?" Grange shivered visibly. "He is not a benefactor. Not truly. He funds theatres because they are the only places where she cannot avoid him. He follows her from stage to stage. He buys his way into rehearsals, into management, into every shadow her life leaves behind." Holmes's jaw tightened. "And why her?" Grange's answer came in a rasped breath. "Because she once belonged to him." Silence twisted through the room like a slow-moving serpent. Holmes leaned forward. "Explain." Grange lifted his face again, eyes reflecting the room's dim lamplight like water reflecting moonlight. "Before she came to London, Evelina Pierce performed in Paris. Small venues, private salons, gatherings attended by those with influence and questionable taste. One patron became enthralled, possessive. She tried to escape him. She fled across the channel, but he followed." Holmes's voice lowered. "A man of wealth, power, and unrestrained obsession." Grange nodded. "And of vengeance." Holmes placed a hand lightly on the table. "What did he want from you?" Grange exhaled a bitter laugh. "Information, news of her movements, her rehearsals, her lodgings. I refused at first, until he threatened someone I cared for. After that, I did as he ordered. Until tonight." "What changed tonight?" I asked. Grange's hands trembled. He said she betrayed him, that he must drag her from her hiding place once and for all, that the theatre would burn again if necessary. Holmes froze. "What hiding place?" he asked. Grange swallowed. "She sought refuge with an old mentor, a voice instructor, near the Strand. She begged him for shelter after Southwark. She trusted him." Holmes's eyes widened with sudden urgency. "His name?" Grange hesitated, then whispered, "Edmund Valewell." Holmes turned sharply toward the door. "Watson, we move, at once." We bounded down the stairs, out into the chill night air. The fog had thickened, swirling like pale smoke around the lamplights. Holmes hailed the nearest hansom with such force that the driver nearly toppled from his seat. "To Valewell's studio," Holmes shouted, "at a gallop." The horses lunged forward, hooves striking the pavement like drumbeats of approaching calamity. Holmes leaned out of the cab, scanning the blurred shapes of buildings flying by. "Holmes," I said, gripping the seat as the cab swayed dangerously, "what do you fear we will find?" His answer came without hesitation. "Valewell may not know the danger he shelters, and the watcher, if he believes Evelina betrayed him, will spare no one standing in his way." We turned into a narrow lane behind a row of shuttered businesses. A small sign hung above a modest door. Edmund Valewell, vocal instruction. Holmes leapt from the cab before it halted. The door stood ajar. Inside, the lights were dim. A chair lay overturned. Sheet music was scattered across the floor like fallen leaves, and then a cry, faint, strangled, from the back of the studio. Holmes dashed forward. I followed, heart pounding with dread. Through a narrow corridor we ran until a final door loomed ahead. Holmes pushed it open, and there, in the center of the room, stood Edmund Vale Well, his face bloodless, his hands trembling. Behind him, a window hung shattered, the night wind billowing the curtains. And Evelina Pierce was gone. Holmes surged toward the window, peering into the alley below. The fog swallowed everything beyond a few yards. He turned back to Val Well. "What happened?" Holmes demanded. Val Well clutched his chest, breath ragged. "He took her," he whispered. "The man with the cane. He broke the window, seized her before I could cry out. He dragged her into the fog. I tried—" Holmes steadied him with a hand. "Which way?" he asked quietly. Valewell pointed with a trembling finger toward the southern alley. Holmes nodded once. Then he turned to me, his voice low but blazing with purpose. "The Watcher has taken her." Outside, the fog pressed in like a closing curtain, and somewhere in its depths, a cane tapped rhythmically against the cobblestones, as though marking the beat of an approaching finale. For a single breath, the alley behind Valleywell's studio remained frozen, as though the fog itself held its vapor-still curtains in anticipation of Holmes's next move. Then Holmes plunged forward, coat flaring behind him like the unfurling wing of some shadowed bird, and I followed at once, my pulse hammering in my throat. The tapping of the Watcher's cane, if it had been real and not merely an echo of terror, had vanished. The fog swallowed sound too greedily here, its milky coils rising from the cobblestones like smoke from an extinguished fire. Holmes moved with preternatural certainty, scanning the ground, the walls, the alley's mouth, his lantern slicing through the dimness. The gaslight from the neighboring street flickered unevenly, casting long wavering beams that made the shadows shudder like living things. Holmes bent abruptly, studying a mark pressed faintly into the damp surface of the stones. "He carried her," Holmes murmured. "The weight distribution is uneven. His right leg favors the injury sustained years ago, but not so severely that he cannot move quickly. Look." He traced the faint indentation of a cane tip. Round, precise, unmistakably deliberate. The same symbol engraved upon its silver handle had marked entries in the phantom ledger. "The Watcher," I whispered. Holmes nodded. "He leaves a trail when he wishes to, and erases it when he does not." A gust of wind teased the fog into new shapes. Holmes strode forward, following the ghost-like steps that wound deeper into the labyrinth of side streets behind the Strand. The city was quieter here. The respectable bustle of the theaters and gentlemen's clubs gave way to narrow lanes where the lamps flickered low, as though reluctant to witness the crimes of the night. Holmes halted suddenly. Ahead of us, a crossroads loomed, one leading toward the riverside docks, another toward Covent Garden, the last toward a darkened courtyard behind a shuttered tenement. Holmes lowered himself to the stones, examining the ground with an intensity that narrowed the world to the space just beneath his palm. "Watson," he murmured, "observe the cane marks here. They deepen—" He paused. "And why would he pause?" I asked. "To choose a direction," Holmes said, "or to listen." He rose slowly, his gaze drifting to the courtyard. A faint light glimmered there, weak, intermittent, as though coming from a lantern shielded by trembling hands. "Come," Holmes said, "but tread lightly." The courtyard opened like a hollow behind the row of buildings. A rusted iron gate leaned crookedly on its hinges. A single lantern flickered near a stack of abandoned crates. Beside it stood a man whose posture sagged with weariness, his face pale beneath the failing light. He was no stranger. "Mr. Carroway," I breathed. The Lyceum's lead actor started at the sound of his name. His coat was askew, his hair unkempt, his eyes ringed with exhaustion. "Holmes?" "Watson," he stammered. "Thank heavens." I feared no one would come." Holmes approached him slowly. "Why are you here, Carraway? And more importantly, how did you get here before us?" Carraway swallowed hard, glancing over his shoulder into the deeper shadows. "I followed him," he whispered. "The man with the cane. I saw him taking Miss Pierce from Valwell's window. I shouted, but he looked at me. Just looked, and I felt as though every word froze in my throat." Holmes studied him with keen scrutiny. "You followed him alone, without alerting anyone?" "I could not risk losing him," Carraway said, voice tight with desperation. "I thought perhaps I could help her, or warn someone." His breath trembled. "But he led me in circles, through alleys, over courtyards. I lost him. Then I saw your lanterns." Holmes's eyes narrowed, and I sensed the shift in his demeanor, the moment when something didn't align. "You lost him," Holmes repeated carefully. "But he permitted you to follow?" Carraway blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" Holmes took one measured step closer, his voice low and incisive. "The Watcher never allows anyone to tail him, unless he wants them to." Carraway opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. Holmes's lantern swung slowly across the courtyard, its light falling on footprints pressed into the dust. 2 sets, one leading in, none leading out. Holmes's voice grew sharp. "Carraway, who knew you would follow him?" No one. I told no one. I simply acted." "Acted," Holmes repeated. "Yes, that is precisely the word." A sudden, brittle silence filled the courtyard. Carraway staggered backward. "You think I'm involved? Holmes, I swear, on my name, on the Lyceum itself. I am no ally of that monster." Holmes raised a hand. "I think," he said, "that you are not here by accident. But whether you are victim or accomplice remains to be seen." Carraway's legs gave way, and he collapsed onto a crate, burying his face in his hands. "I only wanted to protect her," he muttered. "Evelina, she was the first performer in years who reminded me of what the stage could be. I could not let her fall into ruin." Holmes observed him silently before turning away. "Watson," he said, "we continue toward the river. That is where the Watcher retreats when he does not wish to be found." Carraway lifted his head. "Please, take me with you." Holmes met his eyes with cold clarity. "No, your presence would hinder more than aid." Carraway's shoulders slumped. He did not protest. "We left him there, huddled beneath the sputtering lantern, a man drowning in his own exhausted remorse." Holmes moved swiftly toward the riverside alleys, where the fog thickened until it felt almost tangible. The river itself lay just beyond the next row of buildings, its black surface reflecting the moon in fractured streaks. Holmes paused at a narrow dock from which several smaller boats were moored. The air smelled of brine and smoke. A faint ripple disturbed the water. Holmes raised the lantern, and then we saw it. A small scrap of velvet, jasmine-scented, damp with river mist, caught on a splinter of the dock's railing. Holmes retrieved it delicately. "She is close," he murmured. "Closer than he intended us to realize." He stepped forward again and abruptly froze. For from beneath the dock came a single hollow tap, a cane tapping wood. Once, twice, a rhythm slow and deliberate. Holmes's voice dropped into the coldest register I had heard from him. "Watson," he whispered, "we are being watched." Another tap answered him. Then a silhouette moved beneath the dock. Tall, motionless, familiar, the Watcher. Holmes whipped the lantern downward, but the figure vanished instantly, swallowed by the dark passage under the embankment. Holmes drew a sharp breath. "Wanted us to know we are near. He is tightening the circle." "But why reveal himself again?" I asked, heart pounding. Holmes stared into the black gap beneath the dock. "Because," he said, "for the first time, he fears we are gaining on him." A distant splash echoed across the river, faint but unmistakable. Holmes stiffened. "That was no stray sound," he murmured. Someone is struggling in the water. Before I could respond, he dropped to his knees and peered through the slats of the dock's planks. A pale hand broke the surface of the water, clutching wildly, desperately, then sinking again beneath the serpentine coils of fog. Holmes stood in one motion, his voice cutting through the night like a blade. "Watson, she's here!" The river roared in my ears. Our lanterns flickered wildly. The fog tightened its shroud. Somewhere beneath the dock, between the shadows and the water's black churn, Evelina Pierce was drowning. For one instant, the entire world narrowed to the pale, flailing hand that struggled beneath the dock. Holmes was already moving, shedding his coat with swift precision before I had even drawn breath. The water churned wildly in the shadows below us, its surface broken by the fog and the frantic arcs of that desperate hand fighting for purchase. I shouted her name, though in truth I doubted she could hear anything over the roar of the Thames. Holmes dropped onto the lower beams of the dock, gripping the slick wood with both hands. "Watson, hold the lantern steady," he called, and I did so, leaning perilously over the edge as he extended his arm downward. The water surged, lifting Evelina Pierce's face into view for a terror-stricken moment. Her hair plastered to her cheeks, her eyes wide with a fear so raw it cut through the darkness like a blade. Then a current dragged her under again. Holmes took a single breath, braced his body, and plunged into the river. I shouted after him but could barely see anything beyond the trembling circle of light cast by my lantern. The fog swallowed both of them, the detective and the drowning singer, into a tempest of shadows and water. The Thames surged against the pilings, each wave striking with brutal force. For several seconds, I saw nothing but blackness. Then, faintly, an arm broke through the surface again. Holmes had reached her. His voice rang out, hoarse, urgent. "Pull, Watson, pull!" I dropped flat onto the dock, chest scraping the wood, and reached down as far as I dared. Their forms drifted into the lantern's radius. A tangle of limbs, Evelina limp in Holmes's grasp, her head lolling backward. Holmes seized a beam with his free hand, leveraging his body upward in a surge of sheer will. Together we managed to lift Evelina until her hands caught the edge. With a final exertion, Holmes heaved her up onto the dock, and I dragged her fully onto the boards. Holmes followed a moment later, drenched and breathless but unshaken. Evelina lay motionless, her dress soaked, her skin cold as marble. I knelt beside her immediately, pressing fingers against her throat. A faint pulse stirred beneath the skin, a thread of life still present. "She breathed," I said. Holmes exhaled softly, relief flickering across his features only for an instant before the weight of the moment settled back over him. "She was meant to drown," he murmured. He wanted the river to swallow her before we arrived. "Or he wanted us to witness it," I said. Holmes's eyes darkened. "Yes. Always consider the performance, Watson. He stages his work with the precision of a director." We lifted Evelina between us and carried her to a sheltered alcove along the embankment where the fog thinned slightly. Holmes wrapped her in his coat, rubbing her arms vigorously to restore warmth. After several moments, a shudder coursed through her body. Her eyelids fluttered. "Evelina," Holmes said gently, "you are safe, for the moment." Her voice emerged as a thread. I told him no place was safe." Holmes leaned closer. "Who, Miss Pierce? Who took you from Valewell's studio?" Her eyes flicked open, bright, haunted, and shimmering with terror. "The man with the cane," she whispered. "But he was not alone. There was another, a second man, hidden. He said the watcher had unfinished business with me, and that the fire was the beginning." Holmes stiffened. "The beginning of what?" Evelina's breath hitched. "Of erasing everything I ever touched." Before Holmes could respond, a new sound rose from the fog, a slow, rhythmic echo that chilled me instantly. Tap, tap, tap. the unmistakable cadence of the watcher's cane. Holmes rose at once, placing himself between Evelina and the direction of the sound. His body was still dripping from the river, but he stood with the controlled readiness of a man carved from instinct and purpose. The tapping drew nearer, measured, deliberate, tinged with the authority of someone who believed the night belonged to him. Holmes drew me slightly aside. "Watson, we must move Evelina to safety. The watcher is not alone tonight. He employs others, those who owe him loyalty or fear him deeply. But where can we take her?" Holmes's answer was immediate. "To Baker Street. He will not attempt an open assault there. Not yet." The tapping ceased abruptly. The fog parted. A figure emerged. Not the watcher, but a man shrouded in a thick cloak, his face obscured, his movements furtive but strangely purposeful. Holmes tensed instantly, every muscle poised. The man raised his hands, not in surrender but in supplication. "For God's sake," he rasped, "you must listen." Holmes frowned, stepping forward cautiously. "Who are you?" The man lowered his hood. It was Mr. Alton, the young stagehand from the Lyceum, the one who claimed he had searched for Evelina after the fire. "Mr. Alton," I said, startled. "Why are you here?" He cast a panicked glance over his shoulder. "He knows you took her from the river. He knows where we are. He's coming, for all of us." Holmes stepped closer. "You speak of the watcher?" Alton nodded violently. "He made me follow her. He threatened to ruin me if I didn't inform him of every step she took. But tonight he went too far. When he took her from Vale Well, he said he would finish the production he began years ago." Holmes' expression hardened. "The fire at the Red Swan." Alton's eyes widened with terror. "It was no accident, Mr. Holmes, and neither was the fire at the Lyceum." A cold dread seeped through me. "You mean both fires were staged?" Alton swallowed hard. "He wants to destroy the places she touched, to erase them, to burn them away so that she remains only in his memory." Holmes turned sharply toward Evelina, who trembled beneath the coat. "Miss Pierce, did you know?" Her whisper was barely audible. "I feared, but I did not know." Holmes faced Alton again. "Why warn us now?" Alton's body shook. "Because he said he would return to the Lyceum tonight, to finish what he started, and anyone inside, anyone who interferes, will be consumed." Holmes froze. "The Lyceum?" I repeated. "But it is already in ruins." Alton shook his head fiercely. "You do not understand. The fire was only the first act. He wants to destroy what remains, to erase the traces you found there." Holmes straightened. "Watson, we must get Evelina to safety at once. Then we head for the Lyceum. There may be men there already. Perhaps—" He paused. "Perhaps Lestrade and the yard are in danger." I felt a surge of urgency. Holmes lifted Evelina gently, supporting her against his shoulder. "Watson, hail a cab." But before I could move, a sound cracked through the fog. Not a cane, not footsteps. Glass. Shattering. Followed by a distant roar, a glow ignited through the fog to the east, faint but unmistakable. Holmes's eyes widened. "The Lyceum," he whispered. "He has already begun." A new plume of smoke, darker, heavier, rose into the night sky. Holmes turned to me with an urgency that bordered on ferocity. "Watson, run!" We fled through the fog, Evelina trembling in Holmes's arms, the city's lamps flickering like frantic signals. Behind us, Alton followed in terrified silence. Ahead of us! The second fire began to rise. The roar of flames grew louder. Holmes's voice reached me through the pounding of my own heartbeat. "This," he said, "is the penultimate act." We raced toward the burning theater as the night drew breath, and London held its silence like an audience waiting for its final, devastating scene. The night air blazed orange long before we reached the Lyceum. Flames licked the sky like furious ribbons, and the smoke coiled upward in thick, writhing pillars, staining the clouds with a violent glow. Street leading toward the theatre thrummed with alarm. Shouts of constables, the pounding of approaching fire engines, the frantic footfalls of bystanders drawn irresistibly toward danger. Yet amid the chaos, Holmes moved with an almost otherworldly calm, Evelina leaning weakly against him beneath his coat, her breaths shallow but steady. Alton followed close behind us, trembling with each fresh eruption of light that pulsed above the rooftops. As we turned into the final street leading toward the theatre, the full scale of the blaze unfurled before us. The Lyceum, already scarred by the first fire, now roared like a living creature. Its broken dome glowed red, its arches shuddered beneath the heat, and sparks whirled upward in a savage dance that illuminated the panicked crowd. Fire brigades rushed to form their lines along the pavement, their hoses streaming arcs of water that hissed into instant steam as they met the inferno. Holmes scanned the scene rapidly, eyes sharpening as he assessed every detail. "Watson, take Evelina to safety," he called over the roar. "Stay with her. Do not let her out of sight." "But Holmes," he pressed her into my arms with sudden force. "Do as I say. This ends tonight." Before I could protest, he was already moving toward the burning entrance, weaving through constables and firemen with the swift precision of a man who belonged to none of them and yet commanded the ground beneath their feet. A familiar voice shouted above the fray, "Holmes!" Inspector Lestrade emerged from the smoke, his coat singed at the hem, his face blackened by soot. He threw an incredulous glance at us. "Good heavens! Holmes, I was about to send for you. We thought you were inside." Holmes seized his shoulder. "Is anyone still within the building?" Lestrade nodded grimly. Two constables attempted to clear the lower corridors, but never returned, and someone reported seeing a man enter before the flames reached this height. Holmes's face hardened. That was him, the Watcher. He released Lestrade abruptly. "Keep your men back. The structure is unstable, and he will not leave unless forced." I tightened my hold around Evelina, who shook violently as though the heat itself were a memory clawing at her. Alton hovered nearby, his expression torn between terror and the instinct to flee. Holmes moved toward the entrance, but Evelina stirred suddenly in my arms. "Holmes," she whispered hoarsely. "He will be waiting." Holmes stopped. She lifted her trembling hand. "He wants you to come. You're the only one he ever feared." Holmes met her gaze. Something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, sorrow, and perhaps the faintest glimmer of understanding. Then he turned toward the burning doors and strode inside. Lestrade swore under his breath. "Holmes! Blast it! Holmes!" But Holmes had already vanished into the belly of the fire. I passed Evelina into the care of two constables near the waterline, urging them to keep her warm and far from the smoke. Then I returned to Lestrade's side. "I'm going after him," I said. Lestrade grabbed my arm. "You're mad. He told you to stay." "And when has he ever gone alone into a trap and emerged unscathed without help?" I retorted. Lestrade hesitated for only a moment before nodding sharply. "Stay behind me, and stay low." We ducked through the half-collapsed doorway, heat striking us like a physical blow. Smoke clawed at our lungs instantly. I pulled my sleeve over my mouth and pressed forward. The once grand entrance hall had devolved into a hellish labyrinth of scorched beams and swirling embers. Flames crackled along the edges of drapery, and each step sent ash drifting upward like remnants of dying stars. Holmes's trail was unmistakable. His footprints pressed into the soot with the same precision that marked his every movement. They led down a side corridor where the fire glowed less brightly but burned deeper, gnawing at the walls with orange teeth. Lestrade and I pressed onward. The smoke thickened. My eyes watered. The heat seared my skin, yet Holmes's trail continued straight as an arrow. At last, we reached the theater's central aisle. What remained of it? The stage loomed ahead, half collapsed but still standing, its curtains burning in long, wavering tongues. And there, at the center of the ruined stage, stood two figures, Holmes, and opposite him, the Watcher. He was tall and unnervingly still, as though the flames feared to touch him. His cane glimmered with the fire's light, its silver handle casting a serpentine glint. The heat distorted the air around him, lending him an almost spectral quality. Holmes stood poised, coat scorched, hair singed by sparks, yet unshaken. Lestrade and I stood at the threshold of the hall, breath held. The Watcher spoke first, his voice carrying eerily through the roaring flames. "You should not have come alone, Holmes." "You set the stage for our meeting," Holmes replied evenly. "I merely followed your script." A faint smile touched the Watcher's lips. "Ever the performer, even when you pretend to despise the role." Holmes stepped closer. The fires, the ledger, the years of following her. Why? What has Evelina Pierce done that warrants such destruction? The Watcher's eyes gleamed like polished obsidian. "She left me." Holmes's jaw tightened. "That is not a crime." "It is when you give someone your entire being," the Watcher said softly. "I raised her from nothing, gave her music, training, purpose. I shaped her into brilliance, and when her star ascended, she fled." Holmes shook his head. "You did not love her, you possessed her." The Watcher's expression darkened. "She chose another, the young actor at the Red Swan, and when the scaffolding fell, she blamed herself. She blamed me." Holmes's steps slowed. "You were responsible." "She made me responsible," the Watcher said coldly. "Her betrayal destroyed everything, so I destroyed what she cherished in return." "And the fires?" Holmes demanded. "Symbols," the Watcher said. "I burned the stages she graced. I erased the places where her voice touched the air. I wanted the world to forget her as she sought to forget me." Holmes's voice dropped into a sharper register. "Tonight you intended to end her life." "I intended to free her," the Watcher replied, "from the lies she built, from the people who hid her, from you." He raised his cane. The firelight danced along its polished silver tip. "And now," he said, "I shall bring down the final curtain." Holmes moved before the words fully left the man's mouth. The Watcher swung his cane, the silver tip gleaming like a blade, but Holmes seized it, twisting sharply. The cane clattered across the burning stage as the two men crashed into a violent struggle. They moved like duelists, Holmes swift, controlled, calculating, the Watcher driven by a fevered, desperate strength. Lestrade charged forward with a shout, but a falling beam forced him back. "Holmes!" I cried, coughing through the smoke. Holmes dodged a wild strike, his foot sliding across the charred boards. The Watcher lunged with surprising ferocity, but Holmes pivoted, using the man's momentum to send him staggering backward. The stage cracked beneath them. Holmes froze, instinct flaring. The Watcher's heels slipped. The floor gave way. With a thunderous crash, the man with the cane fell through the collapsing boards, disappearing into the burning depths below. A spray of sparks erupted. Then silence. Only the roar of flames remained. Holmes leapt back as the collapse widened, narrowly avoiding the pit of fire. "Holmes!" I shouted again. He staggered toward us, coughing harshly, soot streaking his face. Lestrade grabbed his arm. "We have to get out, now!" Together we fled the burning hall, the fire trailing behind us like a vengeful tide. The moment we burst into the open air, the night swallowed us with blessed coldness. Evelina rushed toward us, collapsing into Holmes's arms, tears streaming down her soot-stained cheeks. "You're safe," Holmes whispered, though his voice trembled with exhaustion. Lestrade barked orders at the fire brigade, ensuring no man was left inside. The flames raged for another hour, reducing what remained of the Lyceum to a skeletal ruin. No trace of the Watcher's body was ever recovered. When dawn broke, pale and mournful, London's fog settled over the wreckage like a shroud. Holmes stood at the edge of the ruins, silent, I approached quietly. "Do you believe he is gone?" Holmes's eyes remained on the ashes. "Some men," he said softly, "do not vanish merely because the fire takes them." "Then what remains?" Holmes exhaled slowly, a breath heavy with truths he would never speak aloud. "Echoes," he said, "and shadows." Evelina stood nearby, wrapped in a constable's cloak, watching the ruins with a grief carved deep into her features. Holmes glanced at her, then back at the ashes. "The final curtain has fallen," he murmured, "but the memory of what it concealed will linger." The wind shifted, lifting a thin wisp of smoke from the charred remains. Holmes turned away at last, and London, as it always did, carried on, its secrets tucked once more into the folds of its endless fog.